All right, we're coming in on the last set of videos for Mill. But before we get into that, I thought it would be a good idea to sort of sum up where we've been so far. So we started the beginning of this sequence of videos with a rough account of the history of utilitarianism around Mill's time. And then I got into what Mill has to say in his book. Right? I said, like, the utilitarians before Mill adopted classical utilitarianism, and Mill had a bunch of different potential revisions that he considered, right? Or that scholars have said he considered. So I want to sum that up here. So we start out with classical utilitarianism, which is a combination of act consequentialism and hedonism. Now, when Mill refers to the principle of utility, he's always talking about a single principle. That's because he runs these things together. He doesn't keep these ideas separate. And I tend to think that's just a mistake on his part. It's better to keep separate ideas separate because you can revise one without the other, which is exactly what most scholars think Mill has done. So, for example, classical utilitarians accepted act consequentialism. An action is right if and only if that action maximizes good consequences relative to the other options available. Well, some scholars think that Mill just kept that. So I have here an arrow going to Mill's utilitarianism. One option is that he just kept act consequentialism. Some people think that's what Mill says. Another option, which I have listed under 1A, is rule consequentialism, which I went over, right, back here. I originally had it in purple in an earlier video. Rule consequentialism says an act is right if and only if, an action is right if and only if it is commanded by the morally correct set of rules in that situation. A set of rules is morally correct if and only if it is that set of rules that would maximize good consequences if those rules were accepted by all. Now, you might remember I expressed some uncertainty about whether rule consequentialism should be stated by using the word all at the end or whether it should be the individual agent. So you can imagine, you can try to imagine what it would be like if just you accepted a certain set of rules, what the results would be, or you could try to imagine what it would be like if everyone accepted that set of rules. Those are both potential versions of rule consequentialism that one could endorse. However, I think if it's true that Mill endorsed rule consequentialism, it's almost certainly true that he endorsed the version that would say all, the more social version, the one where you're imagining everyone in society operating by the same set of rules. And the reasons for that are basically the same reasons that Kant thought you needed to look at what everyone would accept, what principles everyone would accept. That brings us to 2, hedonism, and what Mill has to say by way of revision of that. All right, so unlike with principle 1 in classical hedonism, act consequentialism, nobody thinks Mill retains a belief in just simple straight hedonism. The 2 options are qualitative hedonism or, as I said in a previous video, a complete abandonment of hedonism for something like Aristotle's view of the good. Remember, Aristotle's view of the good was what was good for a human being were the activities characteristic of a human being. Ones that fulfilled the human function. And there are some people who think that's really what Mill believes. Mill believes that's what's truly good. A related view, but still a kind of hedonism, because it still ends up saying pleasure is what's good rather than activities. So remember, Aristotle doesn't think pleasure is in itself good. He thinks activities of certain kinds are good. He thinks it's a good thing when you take pleasure in those activities, but it's only, the pleasure is only good because the activities are good. Right? Whereas qualitative hedonism says it's fundamentally the pleasure that's good. But qualitative hedonism says there are 2 ways to measure the value of pleasure. Implicitly, regular hedonism just says more pleasure is better than less pleasure, right? So consequences are better the more pleasure they include, and worse the more pain they include. Qualitative hedonism, I've got broken into 2 parts here. A, pleasure is the only thing that makes consequences good, and pain is the only thing that makes consequences bad. That doesn't say that more pleasure is always better than less, because B, part B of qualitative hedonism, says pleasures can be ranked by quality and quantity. If pleasures are of the same quality, then the one with greater quantity is better. So if you're comparing 2 high-quality pleasures, and one of them is of greater quantity, like greater intensity and duration than the other, you go with the one that has the greater quantity. Same thing for lower quality pleasures. If they're both lower quality pleasures, you go with the one with the greater quantity. The trouble comes the questions come when you're looking at comparing pleasures of two different qualities. And I ran through three different possible views that Mill might have. One is what I called the multiple view. So I have that expressed here as lowercase Roman numeral 1, or really just I, right? It's not a lowercase Roman numeral at all. Pleasures of a higher quality are worth xy, and lower quality pleasure is worth z, where y is the quantity of the higher quality pleasure, x is some real number, and z is the quantity of the lower quality pleasure, right? So the way that higher quality pleasure works is however much there is, you have some multiple of it. Then there was the Trump view. Pleasures of a higher quality should be maximized first, and pleasures of a lower quality should only be maximized, holding the quantity of higher quality pleasures constant. So the idea is there's no trade-offs. There's no amount of lower quality pleasures that can make up for any amount of higher quality pleasures. So you never reduce your higher quality pleasures to get a lower quality pleasure. That I called the Trump view. Now what I said is that I think the most plausible view is 3 here. A life with some higher quality pleasures in it, I misspelled pleasures, is preferable to any life with only lower quality pleasures in it, right? So instead of saying you never make trade-offs, it just says a life without any lower quality pleasures is always worse than one with higher quality pleasures. But it doesn't mean that every time you have to choose between higher quality and lower quality, you have to go higher quality, right? You just can't ever get rid of higher quality. Those are 3 different accounts of how the relationship between higher quality and lower quality pleasures is supposed to work when you're comparing them. It's something about which scholars still disagree, and we're going to move on from there. Right? So that's the situation so far. We have questions about what Mill thinks, different theories he might have accepted, but it's not clear from the text which. And we're not quite done, actually, because there's going to be a 1b when it comes to consequentialism. And that's going to be sanction consequentialism. But I can't explain sanction consequentialism until I explain a couple things that happen in chapter 3 and the criticism that Mill is trying to rebut in chapter 5. I'm skipping chapter 4 for now. I might make a video about chapter 4. It's an argument, it's a really weird argument for utilitarianism that Mill makes, but you don't need to understand that argument in order to understand what his view is. And for now, I'm mostly concerned with just putting his view out there so you can compare it to the other views we've looked at in this course. All right, so what is sanction consequentialism? And what is the problem that it's supposed to be designed to deal with? Well, the problem is the problem of justice, or in other words, the problem of rights. So what's the problem of justice and rights? Well, it's a problem that any kind of consequentialism is going to face. And it has to do with the fact that it seems like a consequentialist, someone who makes decisions about how you ought to behave, or who says you ought to make decisions about how you ought to behave on the basis of the consequences of those decisions. It comes from the fact that a consequentialist is probably going to have to disregard people's rights, especially if their consequentialism is paired with a view like hedonism. Right? So what's the problem here? Well, consider the following situation. Right? Let's say you have 2 people, one of whom works really hard, and the other of whom is a combination of lazy and irresponsible. Right? So the hardworking person works really hard, makes their money, saves it in a reasonable way. They defer some of their spending and consumption of the money they make through their hard work for later. And over time, they build up quite a lot of material wealth through their own hard work. So they didn't inherit it. They didn't get lucky, right? Like there's some people who get rich and it's just because they were in the right place at the right time. There are some people who get rich just because like a family member dies and leaves them a lot of money. But there are some people who get rich or even just moderately wealthy through hard work, right? They work hard, they get good at something, and they just keep plugging away at it over and over and over. until they build up a fair bit of prosperity. Okay, so that's the one person. And the other person, just they don't work hard, they don't develop their talents. The money they do make from when they do work a little bit, they blow on like lottery tickets and drugs or something. Let's not make it drugs. Let's not have them violating the law. But there's like stupid short-term fun and like bad financial decisions like the lottery. And in case you're wondering, yes, the lottery is always a bad financial decision. It doesn't matter how big it gets. But let's say you've got those two people. We got person one, right, and person two. Person one is hardworking. Person two is lazy. Person one is responsible. Person two is irresponsible. Person one is living in, let's say, material comfort plus excess. And I don't mean they're living to excess. I mean, they've got everything they need for material comfort, and they've got a whole lot more besides. Right? Whereas the lazy and irresponsible person is living in some amount of deprivation through their own laziness and irresponsibility. Now, I want to be clear here. Just like I'm not saying every person who's well off is well off because they're hardworking and irresponsible, I'm also not saying that everyone who's in poverty is that way because of laziness and irresponsibility. Lots and lots of people who are living in poverty are there because of bad luck, the same way that there are some people who are just rich because of good luck. Some people are in poverty because their parents were in poverty, the same way that some people are rich just because their parents were rich. But some people genuinely are poor because they're lazy, right? People who grew up in middle-class households, right, who had every advantage handed to them, but they just like were idiots and they blew them all. They blew all the advantages they had, right? Such people do exist. I've known them. So here's the question. What do we do about the fact that person one has more than they need and person two has less than they need? Well, a fairly common moral view is that some of person one's wealth should be transferred over to person two. And most people are going to accept that, at least when it comes to getting person two out of deprivation. Right? So let's draw it as graphs. Right? We have person one and person two, right? Actually, I'm going to make this a little smaller so it's easier to show the change. We have person one and person two, and we have levels of well-being, right? So the x-axis here is levels of well-being. Okay, and we start out with person one here and person two like this. And let's say the poverty line is right here. Person one is well above the poverty line. Person two is significantly below it. Okay. What a lot of people think is the following. We should, the government, society should force a transfer between one and two. That involves bringing two up to the poverty line, or maybe just above it. All right, so let's. And to do that by taking from one. But the idea most people have, one of the justifications of it, I need to draw this a little smaller. It should be a little smaller than before, is that you don't have to take all that much from one in order to raise two up significantly. Why? Well, because of the law of diminishing returns. Right? There's a fundamental rule in figuring out demand in economics. For every unit of something that you get, for every extra unit, every unit at the margin, that unit of a good is worth less to the person who has it than the previous unit, right? So your first car is worth more to you than a second car. Your second car is worth more to you than a third car, as long as you hold them all equal, right? So it can't be the case that like your first car is a Kia and your second car is a Lexus and your third car is a Ferrari, and like the Ferrari will be worth less to you than the Kia. That's not going to be true. But let's say you buy a Kia and then you buy another Kia. right? That first Kia you bought is going to be more valuable to you than the second Kia in terms of like what it makes possible for you to do, right? You go from only being able to access goods by like walking or public transportation to being able to drive to them when you go from 0 cars to 1. When you go from 1 car to 2, you allow yourself and maybe family members a little more flexibility. Right now you can do 2 things at once instead of 1, but you don't make as big a difference to your lifestyle as you did going from 0 cars to 1. And the third car, I mean, that's just there in case one of the other ones breaks down, presumably. A fourth car would just be there in case you need to lend it to a friend or, for eventually if you have kids and your kids get older. With each unit of something, the value that unit has to you goes down. This is true across a wide range of goods, right? If you eat 1 bowl of ice cream, that's great. If you eat a second bowl of ice cream, that's good. A third bowl of ice cream, and you're like, okay, right? A fourth bowl of ice cream might actually be bad. I mean, in that case, you would get sick. But even apart from getting sick, right? You're just not as excited about the fourth one. The law of diminishing returns seems pretty clearly to apply to money as well. There are some people who've tried to claim that it doesn't, and those people are just silly. But if you have $1 million and you lose $10,000, that doesn't mean nearly as much to you as if you have $10,000 and you lose $10,000. Right? Or if you think it might be unfair to compare someone losing some of what they have and someone losing all of what they have, let's make it a percentage, right? Let's say you have $1 million and you lose 10% of it. What's 10% of $1 million? I'm joking. I know what 10% of $1 million is. You know what 10% of $1 million is. $100,000. Ha! You thought I was actually confused. All right. And let's say a rich person loses $100,000. That bites, right? I mean, that hurts. You feel that. You've got to like do stuff. You might like say, can't have the second vacation this year. Or maybe we have to rent out the vacation home to a poorer family that doesn't have a vacation home in order to make up this difference. Let's say you have $10,000 and you lose 10% of your wealth, right? And you've lost $1,000. Well, someone who only has $10,000 and loses $1,000 isn't going to be thinking, well, maybe no second vacation, or maybe we rent out the vacation home. They're going to be thinking, maybe we don't eat as much every week, right, as we used to. Maybe now, when we get closer to payday, we just eat ramen and we eat it once a day. Right? Something like that. Although actually someone with a $10,000 net worth is already in the upper, I think, 40% of Americans. Most Americans have 0 or negative net worth. So just make it $10,000 in a bank, not $10,000 net worth. Basic point is law of diminishing marginal return, the law of diminishing returns or law of diminishing marginal utility says that in order to get from halfway to the poverty line all the way to at or slightly above the poverty line, you don't have to take nearly as much of a reduction in well-being from 1. Because remember I said this is measuring well-being. This is not money, right, that I'm measuring, it's well-being. So there's a certain amount of money you need to get to the well-being you have at or above the poverty line. 2's not there. In order to make that change, you don't have to have a correspondingly large change in well-being to 1. And because of that, most people, not everybody, but something like 60% of Americans probably, maybe even more, are like, yeah, that's fine, right? We don't want people not having enough food. We don't want people not being able to like meet basic needs. So a lot of people are comfortable with the transition from, and I'll call this one A, and this one B. Even a lot of people who are in situation 1, right? People who stand to lose and not gain very much at all by this transfer. Lots of middle-class people end up paying more to the government than they get in return. Although lots of people in the middle class get a lot of money in some way or other from the federal government in a lot of ways they don't realize. But a lot of them pay more into the government than they get in return because they don't benefit from all sorts of programs that poor people do. Okay. Lots of people are comfortable with the transition from A to B. They don't think there's a significant problem there. But what about the transition from A to C? Right? where person 1 and 2 are brought into a state of equality. Right? This involves not just moving 2 out of deprivation, it involves moving them significantly out of deprivation. It doesn't involve a small reduction in the well-being of 1. It involves a fairly significant reduction. Like before, 1 was probably at least 4 times above the level of well-being 1 would have had at the poverty line. And now in C, 1 is only double that level of well-being. And 2 hasn't just been taken out of deprivation, hasn't just gone from halfway to the poverty line to at or around the poverty line, as in the transition from A to B. In the transition from A to C, 2 is taken from half the poverty line to twice the poverty line. Remember, again, in terms of well-being. Well, if the reason you supported the transition from A to B was appeal to something like the law of diminishing marginal utility or law of diminishing returns, well, that's still going to be true even in B, right? The gap between 1 and 2, person 1 and 2, has narrowed, but it's still the case that you can get larger increases in well-being to 2 than you get reductions to 1 by transfers between them. And that will remain true until 1 and 2 are basically at equality. And so if all you're trying to do is increase the total amount of well-being, the idea is C has the highest total amount of well-being because any transfer from 2 back to 1 is going to need to take more well-being from 2 than 1 receives. That's law of diminishing marginal utility seems to suggest that. Now, there's a lot more that goes into it, right, than just the law of diminishing marginal utility. There's lots of other things to consider, but just focusing on this very simple, very low detail, let's say, case. Seems like there's some pressure if all you want to do is increase overall well-being to just make 1 and 2 end up equal in terms of well-being. And there, a lot of people have problems with this, right? A lot of people who are comfortable even with the transition from A to B, scenario A to scenario B, where you take a little bit from 1 and you get a pretty significant increase to the well-being of 2. A lot of people who are fine with that aren't going to be fine with the transition from A to C, where 1 and 2 end up with materially the exact same quality of life. Why? Well, because, as I said, in this case, person 1 worked really hard for that. And it's perfectly ordinary to think person 1 deserves to be living a better life than person 2. Person 1 was hardworking, person 2 is lazy, person 1 was responsible, person 2 was irresponsible. You can add more to that. Because 1 was hardworking, right? Because person 1 was hardworking, unless they happen to be working in a field that was like bad for society, which there are some, right? I mean, like if person 1 was a heroin dealer, like a really hardworking heroin dealer, their hardworking nature, when applied to the distribution of heroin, is probably bad for society. But make it something like person 1 does medical research, right? And then not only is it true that 1 has the virtue of being hardworking and 2 does not, 1's also contributed more to society than 2, right? All other things being equal, a lazy person doesn't help other people as much as a hardworking person does. So there's all sorts of reasons to think that 1 deserves to be better off than 2. Now, maybe the fact that 1 deserves to be better off than 2 is not a strong enough reason to avoid the transfer from A to B. Because you might say, well, it's true that 1 deserves to be better off than 2, but even in scenario B, 1 is still significantly better off than 2. But that difference is not enough to warrant leaving 2 in destitution. But when we get to the transition from A to C, or even from B to C, then it seems like this isn't fair. This is unjust. 1 has worked their whole life, and now 2 gets to benefit from their labor. And not because 2 is deprived, not because 2 is poverty-stricken, right? Because B would have taken care of that problem. But just because 2 had less. Because if you ask, why should we move from A to B, your reason is person 2 is suffering. Right? Person 2 is like living a horrible life. And yeah, it's their fault. But we don't normally, I mean, most of us don't normally think any amount of suffering is okay if it's the fault of the person who's suffering that way, right? Like, suppose you come across somebody who is, they've got a fork and they're about to stick it in a wall socket and they're covered in water, right? And you say, don't do that. That's a bad idea. And they do it anyway. And they electrocute themselves. You're a sadist if you don't like call the ambulance, though, right? You don't say like, well, that was their own fault. Let them suffer, right? No, you're like, that was their own fault. And, hopefully they learn a lesson from it. So maybe there's something good about the suffering, but we don't want to like let them die, right? That seems to be the situation in scenario A. Person 2 has made bad choices and put themselves into a horrible position. And a lot of people think we should get them to basic competence, right? Basic economic competence. But the transition to C doesn't involve that. If you're at A and say you're choosing between moving to scenario B or to scenario C, I think most people would say, well, there's no reason to go to C rather than B. Right? The only reason to go to C rather than B is just that 2 has less than 1. But you might be like, but 2 should have less than 1. Right? Or in other words, 1 has a right to be doing better than 2, given the way they ended up the way they were. Now, this wouldn't be the case if 1 had just inherited a bunch of money and 2 was born to like poverty-stricken parents in like the worst parts of Baltimore. Then like you'd probably say, well, 1 is richer than 2, but probably doesn't deserve to be richer than 2. But in this case, imagine 1 and 2 are like people who grew up in the same neighborhood. Their parents had the same kind of jobs, working at the same factory. They went to the same schools. It's just that 2's a screw up by their own decisions, right? And 1's not. It seems like consequentialism, which just says increase the total amount of goodness in the consequences, would say you should pick C. But any concern for what justice is or for what people have a right to suggests that you have to take account of how we got in this situation. How did we get into A? Right? If we got into A because 2 was the victim of horrible crimes, right? They were stolen from, they were defrauded, right? Somebody broke into their house and stole all their money. Well, then maybe there's some reason to move to C, right? Especially if, right, 1 can say to themselves, well, if I ever get robbed of everything I own, I'm going to get helped out the same way. But that's not what's happening, right? In my case, we got into A because of bad decisions by 2. And if you only care about the consequences, then it seems like you don't have much reason to care about why 2 is poor. All you care about is that 2 is poor. And you aren't going to have any reason to stop at B. You're going to move all the way to C. Right? You're going to ignore what would very commonly be called the justice of 1 being better off than A, or the fact that 1 has a right to the stuff that they own, right, given how they got it. And this isn't the only case where it seems like consequentialism runs into a problem with rights. Suppose I am practicing my religion, right, in a situation where the majority of society hates my religion. My religion doesn't hurt them in any direct physical way. It's just that they're so bigoted against my religious views that just knowing that I practice those religious views makes them miserable, right? Like they wake up every morning and say, oh, it's a beautiful day, the sun is shining, but I know Mayor's over there being a Wiccan, let's say. Let's say it's like I'm in a society full of Puritans and I'm a witch, right? Or a warlock, I guess. I don't know what I would be, but I practice Wiccan. I practice like this kind of pagan thing. And they wake up every day and they can't get over the fact that I'm down in my basement, like drawing like little goat pictures in pentagrams or so. I don't know what Wiccans do. That might be Satanism that I just described. I have no idea. But just I have some religious views that make them mad, right? Every time they see me, they get really, really mad. Now I'm made happy by my religious views and my religious practices, and they're made mad, but there's like thousands of them and one of me. And let's say each one of them is made, let's add some completely arbitrary chosen at random numbers. Let's say we have 1,000 people in my community and me, and I am receiving 50 units of well-being from practicing my religion. and each one of them is losing 5 units. Well, as you can tell, right, they're losing more units in total than I'm gaining, right? Each one of them is losing a relatively small amount of well-being because I practice my religion compared to the well-being I get out of it. But as a whole, they're losing way more, right? Well, it seems like in this situation, consequentialism would say the community should stop me from practicing my religion, when seemingly I have a right to do that, right? And if the case of religion doesn't grab you, just make it any lifestyle choice, right? Suppose I were gay and 1,000 people in my community were straight, right? And I get a good amount of pleasure from being gay because, I'm gay, right? And then they are just like, it grinds their gears to know that there's a gay person around, right? Seems like consequentialism would say they get to stop me from being gay somehow. I don't know how they do that, but like maybe they can force me to act like I'm not. Maybe they can force me to get a wife and pretend that I love her or something like that. Again, consequentialism seems like it's not going to pay any attention to two things that most people think are of moral importance, right? One of them is the history of how you get into the situations you get in. That's the case I was getting at with hardworking number one and lazy number two. Seems like the past matters for what we deserve. Also, consequentialism doesn't seem like it pays any attention to the moral preferability of having certain parts of your life that just are nobody else's business. Like if they get mad, tough. Right? It doesn't matter if they get mad. It doesn't matter if they're upset with what I do privately in my own home, right? Away from them, right? You might think it's a problem if I'm sacrificing goats outside and praising Baal, the god from Palestine, right before the Jews show up in the Old Testament and everybody there worships Baal. You might think, well, public displays like this is one thing, but if I'm doing it in my basement, if I'm killing the goats in my basement, it's nobody's business but mine. Especially if I give the goats a tranquilizer first. They don't feel a thing. So it seems like consequentialism doesn't pay any attention to these things, rights or justice. And Mill is very, very concerned with both these problems. And he wants to make it clear that utilitarianism doesn't have these problems. And so he is going to develop a theory, I claim, and some other scholars claim, the best scholars, by the way, to replace act consequentialism. Because act consequentialism doesn't provide any way to take account of the past, seemingly. Instead, Mill's going to present something called sanction utilitarianism, or sanction consequentialism, which I'll describe in the next video.